Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Passionomics Podcast, where I'm going to talk about my book, Will of the Stars First Contact, some of the reasons I wrote it, and some of the reasons you might like to read it. Today's topic is the question of utopia. So this is a very big question. I do not like to describe my book as utopian. You will see why by the end of the podcast. But I do like to describe it as non-dystopian, in that it stands against a lot of the modern sci-fi, which is dystopian by default. Now, the reason why most people don't write positive sci-fi is because this is much, much harder to do than writing dystopian sci-fi. So, and a lot of people have a negative association with the word utopia, which I perfectly understand because a lot of utopian schemes fail. But if we are to make a society better, we need to understand what better means. How do we measure better? What features of better are vital? What features of better are better than other features of better? And this is important not just for fiction, but also for real life. What is our vision of the future? How do we even say one society is better than another? Or the future could be better than the past? By what criteria do we even decide all of this? And it seems to perhaps an untrained eye that this question is being considered all the time. After all these political debates are about the nature of society. But to me, this question is considered usually at a very low level, either at the level of tribal affiliation, where what's better is better for my group of people. So if the government gives me more money, therefore it's better. And so that is one layer of politics. And then the next layer of politics may concern social organization, but it becomes very means as an end instead of means to an end. So people will say, well, egalitarianism is better than non-egalitarianism because it just is. There's no sort of underlying goal, underlying great thing that this could accomplish. There's no sort of benefit that your civilization might accrue from pursuing specific ethic or not. So I consider those types of debates to be somewhat frustrating to witness. So I'm going to talk about the process of thinking about the future, and this is a very involved process, and I had to go through this process quite a bit to write a vision of the future. It involves 7 pretty big steps, and I suspect most people will lose me on step 1, but hopefully you will not, dear listener. So the first step of creating a vision of the future is to understand where we are today. What is actually happening in our society? Do we like this at all? And we cannot sort of flinch away from our reality. And there are lots of parts of reality which seem pretty good. There's a big technological progress going on, but also parts of reality seem fairly dystopian. The negative effects of mass immigration is a good example. Wars happen from time to time. And one of the important parts of looking at the reality is to say, okay, well, negative things happen all the time, positive things happen. Are they happening more or less often than in the past? So the second step of predictive vision of the future is to look at the trend lines, the most recent trend lines of how they coalesce. So the US national debt is very high, and the trend line is that it's getting higher, and the trend line may actually be accelerating. That's a very concerning thing. Fertility rate is a very big trend line, and it is declining in most what we call first world, although I don't think this designation is becoming relevant anymore. First world nations is declining fertility rate. That's a very concerning trend line. A lot of political freedoms that we used to associate with the Western world, such as freedom of speech, are also seem to be on decline. There seems to be a big criminalization of speech in various places. I don't necessarily like this trend line, but as I'll talk later in the podcast, I think this is somewhat inevitable. So you look at the trend lines, and then the third step is you look at these trend lines and you predict the default future. So what is the default future? Default future is where all trend lines continue as they are, unless they're counteracted by a stronger trend line. I think that is a perfectly reasonable heuristic for predicting the future. Now, I actually feel like there's a ton of disagreement with this type of heuristic. One big example is the automation of jobs. Automation has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, or arguably since the Agricultural Revolution, when putting seeds into the ground is more automation than going around and getting the seeds. And especially since the Industrial Revolution, there has been worries that automation will just eliminate jobs, and there will be no more jobs and everyone will be poor. And this is the kind of thing that is the rhetoric's been around for a while. And now the jobs are not eliminated at all. And the trend line is stagnant. It's not going towards mass unemployment due to automation. That's not what's happened. And now people will say, no, that's the wrong view. My inside view is that I'm inside the AI company and we're totally eliminating all the jobs in the next 5 years. No, that's not happening. The default future is jobs are going to stay, they're going to change, certain categories will move away. Now, another good example of a default future is the other side of pro-AI people say, okay, no, jobs are going to stay. Good for them to understand the historical trend line. But you know what? The AI will make national debt obsolete, which to me is another ahistoric prediction where, okay, there's been progress in AI since 2000 to 2025. We've come a long way since the early days of Google search. However, national debt has gotten higher. So the trend line of AI progress somehow decreasing the debt or increasing this sort of economic stability of the nation is not very true. Like sure, it may big tech companies may causally improve the economic conditions of the years they're in. However, they do not seem to be doing that sufficiently to counteract the stronger trend of socioeconomic decay, which is evidenced by the debt. So once again, the default future is not, okay, the AI is so great, we're all gonna have jobs and we're gonna have no worry about money. No, we can still have to worry about money, especially in the States. So then step 4 is to understand what parts are inevitable and what parts are changeable. And this is probably the biggest philosophical step here, because it gets into the question of a theory of history. And right now we live under the demolishment of a progressive theory of history, where theory of history has existed until basically 2016, until Trump won, where everything becomes more progressive over time. Cthulhu swims left, as people say. It's year 2016, why don't we have rights for blank group? Why haven't the specific people taken over as the default? Why do white people still exist? It's 2016. So that kind of idea of a narrow line of history which tends towards a specific outcome and always goes in one direction. It was not ever very historical in general, but it was somewhat historical, at least in the last century. In the past, you've had situations where democratic or quasi-democratic nations like Athens would get conquered or absorbed or superseded by somewhat more imperial nations like the Roman Empire. And so this progressive history did not hold in the past, but and many people are realizing it's not going to hold to the future, and they're hoping it's not going to hold to the future. But at the same time, people still hold this belief that certain rights, such as the right to free speech, are somewhat static, and that the government will keep defending them, or at least some oligarchs like Elon will heroically buy X and defend the right to speech. While I'm not so sure that that's the stable state of society. And so when I talk about a theory of history, we need to move away not just from the progressive theory of history, like something going wrong, but also from the civ player theory of history, which is slightly more sophisticated than the progressive theory of history, but is still wrong. And the civ player theory of history goes like, okay, we research technology, technology is a tree, and this tree goes forward. And once we research technology, then we're good. We researched it, we can use it, we can not use it, we will supersede it for the future. But then, for technology, this is somewhat accurate, good enough of an approximation. But then, in Civ 6 especially, you have this civics tree, where you research governments using your culture. And then, once you unlock the government, you could use it at any point, with any combination of technology and government, once you unlock the government. And then in the future, you unlock better governments, and you never go back to the previous government. So now, I will commend Civ 6, at least for getting past the kind of mind-numbing trichotomy of democracy, communism, fascism, and having different governments in the future than those three, which don't necessarily easily map to that trichotomy. So I do like that, but I question the entire premise of the assumption that we never go back to the previous governments. And instead, I propose a new theory of history, which is proposed inside the book. Inside the book, they have a theory of history called the extra history, and they have axioms of extra history. That's what the main interaction of extra history with the book is. Plus, they have some other other interactions, which are also quite important, but I won't spoil them. And extra history considers governments as a tool, but it's not just a tool. They are inevitable consequences of military technology. To some extent, they're consequences of information technology and financial technology, but military technology is the dominant technology that decides the government. And so, to give a historical example of this question, we say, okay, why did feudalism exist? Well, knights were very good at warfare. And why were they good at warfare? Because of a technological innovation which made riding horses easier than before, because of their training, and because of various improvements in armor. And so, combining all of those, you had a situation where this elite knight could really outmatch a large number of peasants, more so than before. And you've created a social structure called feudalism, which paralleled the military structure, where the knights were in charge and the peasants were working for them. And since the invention of the musket, the tables turned. A small number of peasants could defeat a knight, and training with the musket was easier than training with the bow. And now the knights were somewhat obsolete, and we've entered the era of mass armies. This highlighted this which is speaker on the Napoleonic era in 1812, when Napoleon has fought with armies as high as 500,000 people, and that's a very large portion of the population at the time. So we've had these mass armies, which probably hasn't been seen since the Mongol invasions, and we've entered the era of ideology, where the main quality of the army was its size and the quality skill of its commanders. And the size of the army depended upon your capacity to convince enough people to fight for you. So you had the situation where people started getting into equality, fraternity, and egalitarianism as a way to enable these mass armies to distribute power, both to prevent the rebellion, which became much more dangerous, and to have people fight for you in wars of conquest. So, and sort of free speech was born in the American Revolution, sort of around this era of mass armies, and they had this idea of giving this political right to capable militiamen as a form of payment in power for participation in the war and not rebel. Fast forward about 140 years, mass armies were less massive as percentage of population. They were still quite massive, but in World War II we've entered the age of industry. And industry was necessary to equip armies. It wasn't enough just to throw peasants with muskets. You had to have tanks, you had to have airplanes, you had to have some number of people working to build all of this stuff. And therefore, we have altered our social dynamics slightly away from the pure mass army movements, and ideas of freedom of speech gave way to ideologies like the Civil Rights Act, which were more pro-industrial capital. And so we're living in the aftermath where armies have gotten smaller, espionage has gotten more complicated, and the need to convince people to fight for you and the need to block rebellion via these political rights has decreased. So as a result, we've entered a sort of hard to describe era where intelligence agencies tend to be more powerful than industry. I think this era is also about to change with the advent of drones, and we're going to enter a new era, which may go back to more distributed versions of industry rather than centralized versions of industry in World War II. So where am I going with all this? What I'm trying to say is that political power has generally flowed from military power. And it's not just military power of the sovereign, it's just military power of the people. Whether if the elites have more military power than the lower classes, then the elites have a relatively high role in society. Then if we have the era of mass armies, or the era of industry, or the era of something else. So to me, the specific distributions of power, what rights are enabled by the distribution of power, are all, they're not interchangeable across time and across different technological inventions. So, in the book, Will of the Stars, the specific planet we're on, planet Dareth, the dominant military weapon is the spaceship. The spaceship is quite potent. It is frequently armed with thermonuclear weapons that could put large arsenals of Earth, of big countries to shame. A single spaceship could carry much more thermonuclear power than the current nuclear arsenals of a large nation. It could also carry a bunch of other weapons, lasers, railguns, all the good stuff. But the spaceship is the dominant weapon of that particular planet. Other planets rely on other weapons, but this one relies on spaceships. And therefore, the spaceship captains act much more like knights of the past than they do industrialists of today, or they act much more than captains of aircraft carriers today. Because while aircraft carrier is a potent weapon. A single aircraft carrier does not threaten an entire planet. While in Will of the Stars, spaceships are powerful enough that a single one could threaten a poorly defended planet. So, as a result of this dynamic, Will of the Stars, that specific planet operates under a neo-feudal system. And some people may be horrified by hearing that, but it is what it is. That's not a question of goodness, even. We haven't even gotten to the question of goodness. We're still at step 4 out of 7. This is a question of inevitability. And parts of social dynamics, the second axiom of extra history is that the most capable generals find their way to the top of society one way or another. That is a well understood in-universe. And thus, they attempt to do this, finding out of who the most capable generals are without damage to the world via civil wars or rebellion. So the question 4 was a big detour into history. Let's talk about the step 5. And that is the kind of things we care about in society. Once we've determined things that are somewhat inevitable versus parts that are changeable. And when we talk about things we care about, there's 2 big areas of care. The first big area of care is stability, and the second area of care is utility. And when we talk about good societies, especially before 2016, the notion of stability was almost non-existent as a positive criteria of a good society. You would say, okay, well, North Korea has lower utility than South Korea because it has no lights, it has much more diseases, and it struggles with food sometimes. That may be so. However, North Korean fertility rate is higher than South Korea. They're both lower than 2, by the way. So neither of them are stable in terms of demographics, but North Korea is slightly more stable than South Korea. It's going to last longer as a nation, given the current trends continue, which they're likely to do. So when we talk about stability, there is multiple layers of stability. There is economic stability, which very few nations have due to the increased amount of debt that outpaces any innovation that's happened inside a nation. There is demographic stability, whether or not you don't just have the fertility rate above 2. Your productive people in society need to have fertility above 2. The low fertility rate hits the blue-collar workers the most in America. And that is the people who are getting screwed by the current economic arrangement. And once that crop of people begins to disappear, large parts of civilization, like your bridges, your houses, your roads, have a lot of difficulty being repaired because you have a lot smaller generation of people of that class than you used to. And then you have political stability, which is all about whether your political system, whether your power flows are correctly aligned with the military, financial, and information technology of the era. And as a result, you need to change your government to be stable. This is kind of a surprising outcome of the change technological winds. This is the kind of mistake where Russia made this in 1917, where the Tsar may have had a lot of good reforms, but he was unwilling to recognize the growing military power of the peasants. And as a result, there was a revolution. It turned out badly. And in retrospect, the Tsar should have done reforms which may have been economically detrimental to him or to a specific portion of elites, but still rebalance the power of the peasants that was commensurable with their military power. So that is the questions of stability, the questions of economics, demographics, and power. Then the question of utility. And when we talk about utility, that's kind of one of the things that people try to think about when we talk about a good society. And but utility has a lot of deep philosophical questions next to it. Okay, are you optimizing for the total number of people, or optimizing for the average happiness? Are you optimizing for capacity to win wars, or are you optimizing for day-to-day life? And so this comes into kind of the step 6. Once you understand that what you care about is stability and utility, is the creation of metrics of utility. And the metrics, usually you would want to see many metrics to see whether you're stable across time, or what, if any problems arise, they'll show up on the metrics. But when you optimize your metrics, you don't want to have too many of them, because then you don't understand how to coordinate to optimize them. So, in Will of the Stars, the society, the empire as a whole, really understands 2 big metrics of utility that's different from stability metrics. That first metric is life expectancy, and the second is space exploration. What a surprise. Now, the planet Deriv that we're on in that book is much more tuned towards the space exploration angle rather than life expectancy. The core worlds of the empire, which exist close to Earth, are much more tuned towards life expectancy and other things related to it, like happiness, free time, capacity to meditate, capacity to reach spiritual insights and advanced spiritual states. So that's the metrics of the core worlds, but they all really flow from life expectancy as a North Star. While Deriv is much more of an explorer, fighter archetype. Of course, the discussion about metrics of utility cannot be complete without the elephant in the room, which is called GDP. GDP is it's become a controversial metric, and it's good it's become controversial. It's good people are questioning it, whether this has anything to do with what we really want from society. It used to be that GDP was very correlated with life expectancy, and it made sense that we wanted. It used to be that GDP was also very correlated with the capacity to win wars. But it is less correlated now. So we have to ask the question, did we optimize GDP so far as we are seeing a decoupling of the things we care about and we need a new metric? Or are people cheating in GDP? Or was it actually wrong in the first place? I think some combination of all 3 is correct. We need to reconsider that $1 trillion given to the infrastructure bill adds $1 trillion to GDP but does not build any infrastructure. That is a flaw of the metric. And there's various other financial operations that exist in this metric that should not be counted as contributing to GDP. There is a bunch of zero-sum battles, like legal battles, or sometimes battles over medical billing, which should not contribute to GDP unless they're actually helping someone. And so this question of utility feels like it has a default answer the moment you ask it, which is GDP. But the moment you deep dive into GDP, you realize, wait a second, this is not what we want. We want civilization to survive. And the GDP looks more and more anti-correlated with survival. It looks more anti-correlated with fertility rate, and it looks to be becoming even anti-correlated with crime. It's crazy to say that. Like we used to have poverty creates crime, but on the world scale, GDP maximizing countries who care about GDP more than fertility rate are starting to import a number of immigrants, obviously in Europe, which commit a ton of crime. So a lot of these questions of what creates a good society, stable society that's worth living in, seem to be becoming completely decoupled from the overall utility metric. And this is something we need to think about very carefully, how to transition away from GDP. But in Will of the Stars, they did it pretty violently, as if you read the backstory through the quotes beginning of the chapters, but they did. Okay, now that you've got through the 6 steps, okay, let's review where they are. We understand where we are, we understand the trend lines, we predict the default future, we understand what parts of the future are changeable, which parts are not. We have a theory of history which fixates those parts and looks at which parts are, have wiggle room. We understand what we care about, that is stability and utility together, and we have to prioritize stability because by default solution is not stable. And we have a group of metrics of utility, and we have a couple of them which are our North Stars. Once we go through all of these, we can figure out what the golden path is for humanity or for a particular fictional universe. So now the reason why I don't like to call the specific planet Deref on which Will of the Stars is set to be utopian is because they don't consider themselves utopian. They may think correctly that feudalism is the most stable arrangement, or neo-feudalism with a bunch of gamer characteristics. How shall I put this? But they do not view this as a final state of their society. Their society is new. It is only 300 years old on this planet. Once it reaches 1,000 of years old, it becomes more wealthy, and it is capable of moving away from spaceship as the dominant weapon platform and into megastructures such as orbital rigs. Those megastructures create a type of ownership and a type of systems that are no longer fully reliant on spaceship captains, although they're still important, as your dominant form of military power. Therefore, they switch their government once this megastructure is complete and once the ownership of it transfers in some other fashion. They go into the mid-worlds, which run on a system called Universal Basic Shares, which is a system I'll discuss in later podcasts. That is kind of the process of framing the question of utopia, of approaching the question of utopia in this very deep systematic way, which allows for proper disagreement and debate with each piece of the puzzle. You say, okay, do we disagree about where we are? Okay, that's a factual disagreement. Do we disagree on the trend lines? Okay, that's interesting. That's something you can bet on, consider historical questions, debate inner models versus outer models. Do we disagree on the utility question? Do we disagree on the values of how many people should exist on Earth? Do we disagree on the decision-making process of how that comes about? Do we disagree on parts of the inevitable? Do we have a different theory of history? So once you kind of break it down, this question of utopia, I think the debate can become more productive than, it could rise to the higher level than saying, oh my God, these people in this universe, they don't have rights because they can't vote, and therefore it's bad. Well, what they have is utility. They have no crime. Okay, that's a stability metric. They have high life expectancy, 400 years. They consider it low, but it is 400 years. They have a large stretch of youth. Most of that 400 years is actually youthful 400 years, the kind of 20 to 40-year-old would feel, is how they feel from 20 to 300. They have lovely marriages, they have lots of kids, they have lots of cool experiences they can do, and the baseline happiness and level is much higher than it exists today. The type of suffering that you experience through either being overworked, which they're not, or through being sick, which doesn't happen there. The type of suffering you experience, the anxiety about your society crumbling, your society being unstable, this dystopianism, this doom scrolling, they don't have it. So you would say, well, is it worth having that instead of having the right to vote? Well, you can't get the right to vote because the spaceship captains who control the most powerful weapons in the world get the vote, and you don't. Still, they don't consider all of these positive factors enough to make themselves utopian. The core worlds might call themselves utopian on some days, but that's a different story for a different book, for a different series. So yeah, I think that has been a good podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.